and the United States issued a joint statement on the climate crisis over the weekend. Many believe the unified actions against climate change could be able to help the two countries cut through the difficult rancor. On that, I talked to Thomas Friedman, whom I have enjoyed frank conversations with over the years. He's also participating in this year's Boao Forum, and here are his thoughts.
I actually saw Secretary Kerry before he departed for China.
Right.
China still is highly dependent on coal. So China also does a lot with wind and solar and hydro and many other things, but it's still using a lot of coal. Mm-hmm. I think the concern of Kerry is this, that he wants America to increase our commitments, okay? So it's very hard to get America to increase its commitments if there's a perception that China is still reliant on a lot of coal, because politically here, what will happen is people will say, well, why should we take on greater costs for clean technologies when our biggest trade competitor, China, isn't? So we've got to find a way to harmonize what America and China are doing on this. Otherwise, both countries will use the other as an excuse to do less rather than more.
It seems that I have to disagree on that point with my good friend Tom. China has already committed to 2030 carbon zero, 2060 carbon neutrality. And you know, from carbon zero to carbon neutrality, 30 years, that's probably very, very short compared to the US experience, which is like 50 years, the EU's experience, which is much likely to be 80 years or more. So from those numbers, one could see the commitment is high, and now China is working on the roadmap. But we haven't heard much about the US commitment and exactly what the roadmap is.
Basically what's going on in America is that we're basically phasing out of coal. That actually happened under Trump, not because Trump wanted it, but because the market really drove it.
Yeah.
And you do still have a lot of cities and provinces in China that are committed to coal because they have a lot of it and it's cheap and it's a job creator. And so I think we've got to harmonize those two things. China, to its credit, has set some very high aspirational goals. America under Biden is doing the same. And I think that this dialogue between John Kerry and China's climate team is very healthy. Because if you go back to Paris, Paris only happened because the US and China and India basically got together. That's what made Paris happen. And so Glasgow, the next phase of climate mitigation, it's only going to work if China and America are working together.
Now, here's one thing, the North and South thing. I know it's not necessarily the freshest topic. The climate talk has been so hard to achieve any consensus because developing countries and developed countries have very different history in terms of how they tapped into the world's resources and has been polluting the world, so to speak.
The question is very fair. We got to go dirty before we really fully understood the implications to the climate of dirty. A lot longer than any developing country. So our obligation, it seems to me, is to grow clean faster and use our leverage to bring the price of clean green technologies down, precisely so the South countries, the developing countries, can get access to them, deploy them profitably. What I like about what you and I are doing right now, what John Kerry is doing with his Chinese counterparts, is we're engaging in what I call the Earth race. In the 60s, America and the Soviet Union had the space race.
Right.
Who could be the first to put a man on the moon or a woman on the moon? What China and America need to have is the Earth race, where we compete with each other for who can invent the most clean green technologies so men and women, plants and animals, can stay here healthily on Earth.
The other issue is about industrial policies. When China put out the plan 2025, there were enormous amount of criticism against China's so-called industrial policy. That's not the way it should be. And yet the Biden administration coming into power and suggests let's have very strong industrial policy. I'm confused. What's going on?
I think that we are really in a process of transition here, and you are going to see America adopting a much more Chinese-like industrial policy approach. we'll do it in our own way,
Yeah.
because we really don't have state-owned industries. But I think you'll see a much more intense effort to have government support for research, government support for critical industries through tax breaks. We are going to adopt some of China's methods rather than trying to force China to adopt our message, which is what a lot of the trade negotiations kind of had been about. And so I think you'll see a lot more industrial policy in America. I think there's a perception that it's the only way we can remain competitive. And you're right to point out that the political consensus on that has changed here.
But think about America, the moonshot, the gene sequencing, and even now Elon Musk working on the outer space exploration with huge support coming from NASA. All of this are industrial policies, and they date back decades ago. One could argue that China also learned from the United States to begin with. Tom.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, and I think that you're seeing much more of a convergence between our two economies, and I think each one is seeing what is the best of the other that they can adopt to drive their own economies forward. There's still going to be, and still are, real trade issues, reciprocity, access. Those are going to be real issues. They remain real issues where I think there are legitimate American complaints. But broadly speaking, as globalization shrinks the world way from size large to size medium to size small, you're seeing all these economies converging in a lot of ways.
Earlier, I was reading some of your wonderful articles. In fact, I'm a fan, just like millions around the world, Tom.
Thank you.
You talk about the world is changing in the way that China and the United States, not necessarily about this, what you call the unconscious convergence, integration, but now into a competition in which ideology has become the leading force, shaping the two sides against each other. Now, if there's convergence, as you argued earlier, that we are learning each other, why should we allow ideology, which is rather very much a concept, to divide the two and let that shape everything?
Well, the argument I was making, which you've alluded to, is that I believe the era 1979 to 2019 will go down as an epoch in U.S.-China relations. And it's the epoch I call unconscious integration, where if I wanted to have a supply chain that started in Tianjin, if I wanted to have a factory in China, if I wanted my daughters to study at Fudan University, I could do all of that kind of unconsciously. I didn't have to really think about it. And if you wanted to have their stocks listed on the NASDAQ and buy part of a factory in Ohio, Chinese could do that as well. And so there was a lot of unconscious in that we didn't have to think a lot about it. And because of that, China and America, in my view, became the real one country, two systems. Not China, Hong Kong. It was really China and America. We became one country, two systems with a lot of issues, whatever. Now that began to break down about 10 years ago, because during most of those 40 years, America sold China what I call deep goods, things like computers and software, things that went deep inside China's system. And China had to buy our deep goods because it didn't have them and could not make them. We bought, and China sent us what I called shallow goods, things I wore on my back, my shoes, my feet, solar panels I put on my roof. Well, about 10 years ago, and this is a very good thing, China developed the capability also to make deep goods. That's what Huawei 5G represents. But here we come to a problem. When we only bought China's shallow goods way, we didn't care at all. Okay, but when it comes to buying your deep goods, then the question of values really matters. We're seeing now that this era of unconscious integration is over. Now, this saddens me for this reason, that the globalization that's happened in the world in the last 40 years has been so much driven by U.S.-China relations, by that unconscious integration. And as a result of that, the world became more prosperous and more peaceful. If this unconscious integration ends, and it does seem to be ending, the world will be less prosperous and it will be less peaceful.
Having said that, though, the whole human rights issue is a very important debate. We didn't see that debate go more in depth, but rather only at political level. So what should be our priority, and whether it is still important to be able to make sure that we do it well while we preach, or it doesn't matter anymore as long as it is a political tool?
I think substance really does matter. We kind of need some confidence building measures right
Yes.
now between our two countries.
Yes.
And both countries, I think we would benefit from each doing something a little hard, not something easy, but something hard. From my view, if China took steps to provide transparency on what's going on with Uyghurs, if nothing else, to take steps on democracy on Hong Kong, however big, but something that said, okay, we hear you, it would have a big impact here. At the same time, China may say to the United States, well, we need you to take steps, say, on Huawei. You just put a death sentence on our leading technology company. One of the things I've actually suggested is that we say to Huawei, we are going to let you wire a single state, Idaho, say, for a couple of years. And we will test and we'll see how it goes. That we need to build a pathway for Huawei to become what we consider a good international actor. We each, I think, need to do something hard to get these others' attention and to break what is kind of a fever right now, a fever that's just getting worse and worse and worse, and taking the relationship into directions that I think are really unhealthy for each other and the world.
That's really constructive suggestion, I would say, Tom. My concern, I'm a journalist, so I'm always pessimistic to a certain extent, you know that. My concern is whether the right thing, when it is being done and said and also discussed, will be shaped totally in a different way. I'm just afraid when the air is toxic, everything becomes poisoned, no matter how good the delicacy they are. That is my concern. Tom, am I overreacted?
No, you're not. There are there's a body of people in our political system who have, ill will toward China. They think it's a communist menace and a devil. There are people like myself who have been committed to building bridges where possible and drawing red lines where necessary, where we disagree. Unfortunately, my part of the coalition, the political debate, as it were, is really shrinking. We've been weakened, I think, in my view, by things China has done, but we've been weakened. And I think there's a mirror on the Chinese side. There are hardliners in China who believe America exists purely to put China down, to resist its rise. I sit back some days and ask myself, but what are we fighting about? What are we afraid? Do I think China wants to occupy Los Angeles? No. I mean, really, does anyone in China think America wants to occupy Shanghai? I mean, it's not like the Nazis in Europe. I mean, what we've really got here are a legacy power and a rising power, and they're in this sort of competition to figure out how to actually coexist with each other.
Right.
From an American point of view, see, we've had enemies, that we've, like the Soviet Union, we had a Cold War with, but they were never our economic peer. China's our economic peer. One day it may be our equal. One day it may be our superior, for all I know. You know what I mean? And we're wrestling with that whole issue, as is China. The only thing I can say is what you and I are doing is healthy. What I am missing, and what is not the only solution, but what's to be part of the solution, is what you and I are doing when I could go to the Bao Forum and talk, and people could ask me hard questions, and I could answer as best I could. And what's making the situation worse is we're not just in antagonism, but we're disconnecting. So that's why anytime I'm invited on to something like this, especially by a friend like you, I take advantage of it. I
Right.
speak my mind. I speak as frankly as I can,
And
but we
we
talk
really
respectfully
appreciate
to one
that.
another.
Having said that, though, Tom,
And
you know, go
I
ahead.
have many
Go ahead.
critics. No, I say I have many critics in America.
I know that's
Oh,
what I want to
Friedman,
ask you.
you you love China. No, look, I'm simply looking out for my kids. What is going to be the healthiest world for my girls to grow up in? Is it a world where China and America are in antagonism? Is it a world where China and America are building bridges where possible?
I respect you for that. It takes a lot of courage, enormous amount of courage, in fact.
Yeah.
The other thing is, there are people saying things about China in the United States, I would assume, but I'm trying to figure out why people are trying to do it, exaggerate even sometimes about what China is like. One country needs a kind of momentum to move forward. That's true for China. That's especially true for America right now. But is it fair to use China to fear Americans out of their complacency?
It's a very good question because I'm guilty of that. I often use China, not in any kind of racist way, but I will say to Americans the following: when I am in China, it takes me 4 hours and 11 minutes to take the bullet train from Shanghai to Beijing.
Yeah.
When I'm in America, it takes me 19 hours and 21 minutes to take our bullet train from New York to Chicago, and it's shorter. And where I use China as a threat, not that China's going to come over here and take your, city over or whatever and impose Chinese communism. What I'm trying to tell Americans is that we have become, in many ways, fat, dumb, and lazy, and that we are now living in a globalized world where the difference between the energy and aspirations of a country like China and energy and aspirations of America will really start to matter. There's a reason, we're talking before the show started. Why am I writing about America? I'm not worried about China. I'm not thinking about China. I'm thinking right now about my own country. And I'm not saying this for your audience to make them feel good. I'm saying it to make me feel bad. My country's not right. Our democracy isn't working the way it needs to. And that's my concern. That's my biggest concern right now. There are too many people in America. If you want to know what's new, if you said, Tom, what's the newest thing in America that worries you? It's that you can get really rich now through polarizing people and presenting misinformation. And that is really hurting us. Whatever is going on in China, it is, this is what is my concern right now.
And I guess there's one important challenge about the rules. Now, with a changing world, the rules will be redesigned or adjusted. The question is, who designed the rules? Who adjusts the rules?
If you look at the history of the world, ideas don't just win. Good ideas don't just win, or bad ideas don't just win. It depends on power. Okay, ideas need power to spread. And what I think is going to happen though is that we're going to enter a kind of two-rule world. Okay, that is, for the most part, after World War II, if we just use trade, for example, well, the rules of trade were pretty much set, by the Bretton Woods, agreements, and those agreements were really set largely by America, and it's what it thought was right and what it thought was in its interest. And I see a world now developing where there's going to be a kind of Chinese rule world in terms of technology, and an America rule world in terms, at least, of technology, if not other things. And we're going to have to find a way for these two worlds to coexist, to overlap, to integrate. But there's no question that America is not going to submit to China's rules on things. China is powerful enough not to submit to America's rules on things. And therefore, most likely, we're going to go to a world defined by a kind of Chinese rule space and an American rule space. Countries are going to have to choose between the two to some degree. And to some degree, we're going to have to find a way to make them work together.
My final question for you, Tom. I'm worried, not because of the previous questions I asked you, that those are already worrisome enough, but because as a journalist, The limits of traveling as a result of the pandemic has been tremendous. We need to know the world in order to judge where the world is and be able to report it with the right proportion to our audience. How are you solving those problems, particularly at a time when things are changing so fast? How are we going to put our hands on the right thing, feeling the right pulse, knowing the right rhythm?
Well, the way you just hit on such an important point, I always had a motto as a journalist: if you don't go, you don't know. You and I are old friends, so we can have a conversation, and it's almost like we saw each other yesterday. So we can pick up where we left off. But it's not like being able to sit down, we have an interview, and then I get to walk the streets of Beijing and Shanghai. People stop me, they say things to me, I learn things. So I really, really miss that. Look, we have real differences. We really disagree fundamentally on issues, and I've talked about them. But at the same time, there's just so much we're missing by way of nuance. And I can't wait for this pandemic to be over. I hope one of the first things that happens is that China lifts its restrictions on foreign journalists, that we lift our restrictions on Chinese journalists. We maybe start over a little bit, because no good way will come from us not having the reporting from each other's countries. And there are things that we will write in the New York Times that will really upset you. There are things you will write that will really upset us. But in between all of that, there'll be a lot more communication, a lot more contact, a lot more understanding. I want as many Chinese students in our universities as we can possibly fit. I mean, we had almost 350, 400,000. I'd like to double it. I'd like to double it, and I'd like all of them to stay and become workers and employees and inventors and innovators here and bring their energy. But we've got to find a way to get back to that. I know that's not going to be easy. I'm a kind of romantic for that previous era of greater integration. I think we're headed for a choppier period now, but we need to find a way to limit it. And that's my wish.
Tom Friedman, as always, what a pleasure.
Pleasure was all mine, Wei. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom.